Hello and welcome to another modelling video. This is Alan from the Makota Man YouTube with another Q&A session. Last week I put out a video asking for questions, and this week we'll be answering them. We do not have a lot of questions, though multiple parts to each question, which will fill this out quite nicely. If you do wish to contribute, have your personal project featured, or contribute, just wait until next month and throw in questions when the video appears in your feed. Now, the past few question request videos have been flagged, demonetized, or considered to be undesirable content by YouTube. I have changed the titles, pictures, tags, all those bits and pieces, and now it's in the all clear. Not so much as a money-making operation, but more so if it's deemed demonetized, it's not going to appear in subscription boxes or recommended. So this has finally been resolved. Just before we get into it, my efforts in recovering Facebook and my public pages is going very well. The majority of my catalogue of models is up, and I'm starting to put up work in progress pics and other hauls, interesting bits and pieces, as well as some very useful tools, tutorials, and resources that may assist in your modeling or hobby endeavors. Links, as well as links to the other platforms, are down below in the description section. As well as Facebook, I have opened up on Tumblr. Most of the catalogue is also up there, as well as work in progresses and other bits of content of interest. Eventually, once everything's up, I'll start putting links to videos and all of that jazz. I also find Pinterest to be an absolute amazing platform for research and reference material. I've also created a board with builds, and going to be putting a lot of event and competition models up there in the not so distant future. I still have my pitch as well as my fundraising project, and no need to contribute, just more of something to scratch up, be familiar what I'm up to, and some big projects, research goals that I'm trying to achieve. More or less the manufacture of small runners to create model kits and aftermarket parts, styrene garage kit. In the past month or so alone, I've raised about $800 to $900, so that is going very, very well. Looks like we should definitely meet the goals set out in that video, worth checking out. And finally, as of late, I've been very active on Twitch, doing 1 to 2 streams a week for a period of 2.5 hours. That is picking up very, very well. It's getting close to affiliateship, so we'll keep up with the grind. It's just generally when I'm sitting down and doing my usual modelling, add a bit of commentary to it, and if there happens to be anyone in the chat or watching, very happy to talk about current affairs immediately, show demonstrations, explain what I'm doing, just a bit of fun. It's definitely something that I'd love to see the scale modelling and gunpla community to branch out in and interact in a live manner to help educate each other in modelling methods and growing as a community, tutorial and technique wise. Now straight into the questions. John asks, hello, what airbrush paints would you recommend to a beginner? Why do I struggle so much with airbrush ready acrylics like Vallejo Model Air? Should I try a different brand of paint? Thanks. Hello John. Vallejo does seem to be an acrylic pigment, though its vehicle or thinner base is polyurethane. It is a very fragile chemical that's easily disturbed or off-centered when it's in airbrush, hand painting and whatnot, and also happens to be a paint that doesn't like to bite or adhere to surfaces very well. It has amazing applications such as hand painting figures and whatnot, though Unless you're equipped with the correct equipment, thinner vehicle, as well as knowledge of how the product works with a little bit of airbrushing experience under your belt, or explicit demonstration of the use of this product through a airbrush, you're really going to struggle, especially if you're watching other gunpla YouTubers putting alcohol-based acrylics or lacquers through their airbrush. The two processes are completely different. Your airbrush should exclusively be used for polyurethanes or Vallejo only. Only use its brand recommended thinner, as well as brand recommended airbrush cleaner. You can run water through it. Any sort of cross-contamination of another product, thinner or paint, it can chemically react with the paint, instantly turning it into a thicker consistency or jelly, and it's going to be stuck in your airbrush and very difficult to strip down and clean thoroughly for Vallejo to go through it again, risking whatever set it off as contamination will still be there. Not a very beginner-friendly paint for the airbrush or gunpla in general. It works very well for some modelers, others not so much. I'm vocally not a big fan of it, though choose not to rubbish those who can appreciate great results coming out of it. Give it another go with this knowledge, though I also recommend these other alternatives. You can go what is recommended by Bandai, Mr. Color Lacquers. There's also another brand called Guy Note, as well as a plethora of other smaller homebrew brands, automotive and whatnot. It cuts with just generic lacquer thinner, a 50-50 mix, and you can achieve very smooth instant results. Or some of the airbrush ready stuff is just pour and spray, fairly easy to clean and reactivates with thinner. Does have some drawbacks, however. The fumes can be very strong and is fairly hazardous to your health and those around you. Can linger also for a very long time. Not recommended to be used indoors unless you have a proper respirator, extractor booth and a dedicated hobby room that's not going to affect the rest of the house. Now, if you cannot source any of the lacquers, or the smell's too strong, doesn't work where you live or with the people you live with, alcohol-based acrylics are a very good second choice. A little more difficult to airbrush, though far more easier and forgiving than Vallejo. A little bit of practice and you should be up and running in a very short period of time. Tamiya, as well as Aquarius Hobby by Mr. Hobby. Two good brands. They are cut, or their vehicle is isopropyl alcohol. You can use 90 or 99% of that, or the individual brand of thinner and airbrush cleaner. The airbrush can be cleaned with water if it has not dried, or methylated spirits. You can thin it just a little bit, about 1 part thinner to 2-3 part paint, or if you want to start doing shading and whatnot, 50-50. The smell is nowhere near as harmful, can be possibly used indoors, water soluble, and it's just far more friendlier if you're in a shared residence with other people or whatnot. Both the lacquers I've recommended as well as the acrylics are fairly globally available and easy to source, even if online. The next comment is fairly involved with multiple questions. We'll divide each into individual question sections and address them at a case-by-case basis. Hi, I plan to buy an airbrush in May, so I have some questions regarding that. Do you know any primer that I can airbrush that isn't toxic smelly? And at what kind of pressure and needle size should I airbrush a primer? Same as the first question, but regarding matte gloss varnish, also, do I need to thin it? All decent primers, lacquer. This is a very strong material and thinner that can actually eat into plastic and give you the perfect foundation for paint to be applied and not peel or come off. Vallejo does do a primer, though it's pretty much a textured version of their paint and has adhesion problems, especially for gunpla on styrene. I would recommend using a lacquer. Mr. Finishing Surfacer 1500 Grey is excellent, as you can use it in a standard airbrush. Any other airbrush, you could use a larger needle nozzle combination at 0.5 millimeters. You could buy a Hyoscene very cheap off eBay or Amazon, change the needle nozzle around cheaply, and spray that through no problem at your standard PSI of 11 to 15, though with a larger diameter, more up to 20 PSI. If you really must airbrush indoors, or if smelly paints is a huge issue for you, maybe purchase just your primer in rattle cans. It does not have to be the hobby branded ones. You can go to a hardware or automotive store, make sure it's lacquer based primer or primer for plastics. Shake it thoroughly well and apply it in very thin coats outside in the garage or anywhere that's not affecting other people, and then do all of your acrylics and colour based airbrushing indoors or wherever you're doing it. Now, same question with matte or gloss varnish. You can source them in lacquers, acrylics or enamels and run them through an airbrush, no problems. As per the previous question, the Aquarius Hobby by Mr. Hobby, as well as Tamiya, does a really nice, not so harsh acrylic spray that you can mix and add to your airbrush. You do have to, however, thin them, about a ratio of 50-50 with their indigenous brand of thinner or isopropic alcohol. So pretty much anything you pour in an airbrush, you always have to prepare, thin, check the consistency, then pour in the airbrush. Don't mix it in the airbrush, except for brands that are truly airbrush ready, such as SMS, Alclad and whatnot. Do you have experience airbrushing Vallejo model color? I have around a dozen of them, so I would like to use them. Unlike Model Air, which we've addressed in the previous question, model color is more thicker and specially designed for hand painting. I have airbrushed it on 2 occasions for projects a long time ago when I was experimenting with polyurethane. Using the Vallejo thinner, you can bring it down to a point where it runs through an airbrush at a limited capacity. I'm sure if I practiced more, I could have gotten far more nicer results with gradients and effects and whatnot. Very difficult, not ideal for a beginner now. Maybe something you can experiment later. Just use it for hand painting and touching up small details, and see if you wish to use it at a later date. With its risk of clogging up and causing damage to your airbrush, I would hold off it for a while now. I tried to paintbrush Future Floor, but instead of hard gloss, I kind of get a waxy to touch gloss. Is this supposed to be like that, or I did something wrong? Thanks, man, and sorry for the bad English. Generally, I deal with a lot of ESL people at work and whatnot. Never apologize. You're engaging in the language, you're engaging in the community, you're doing a great job. Keep practicing, keep contributing. Do not apologize for your English, it's quite good. Now, Future is a strange animal that doesn't quite work like paint. It's very, very slow to dry and behaves differently if you dip a part, airbrush a part, or hand paint a part. When you hand paint, it tends to be a bit thicker, streakier, that sort of thing. Being so thick, it takes a very long time for it to dry to the touch, which could be several hours, and then to chemically harden and become really nicely self-leveled, hard clear. That could take a number of days, up to a week, until it looks good. So at first, when you paint a part and it looks very cloudy, just put it aside, look at it the next day, wait for a few more days, and I promise you at that state it will be clear and hard. If it's not ideal, you can polish it further, apply another coat, though consider it's a very slow drying product. While I'll have you here, I'll throw in a few extra tips. Don't be afraid to experiment with airbrushing it. It is so thin, you just pour it straight into the airbrush and apply. If you go on a bit too thick, it has a tendency of pooling and dripping. Once you're airbrushed, you'll see where it's pooling and drips are forming immediately. Touch with a bit of tissue and all the excess will be absorbed. The damage that you've caused will self-heal in about 5 minutes to a putty state. Allow it to go in its weird cloudy form, and then it will clear up, and in a few days time will be nice and hard to the touch. I have one more question. In painting a FG RX 782, I have a little problem with joints, part of them. Image provided, image will be at the next stop. I painted the joint first, then slapped the other part of the leg, but when I try to bend the leg, the paint chips comes off. How can I prevent this? Also, should I paint the joints first and then put the leg together the other way around, full assembly, the leg, arms, then painting the joints? Cheers, thank you. I happen to be familiar with this kit. The articulation is very, very stiff, and you'll have parts touching parts. It doesn't matter if you paint then assemble or assemble then paint. The joint is so close, it's going to scratch the paint regardless, and also account what sort of paint you're using. Before you paint the joint, consider some steps in preparation. Have a look at picture number 2. What you can do is around the opening joints that the inner knee joint is going to be touching the lower leg, do a bit of sanding and trimming to widen the area in the mouth so there's clearance that the parts are not touching. Nothing will be scratched. Secondly, when you prime then paint, allow the maximum amount of time to dry and harden fully, so when you assemble it and paint the lower leg, put it together and move it around, you're going to have a hard scratch resistant paint. You're going to have a fair amount of clearance between parts, and that should be fine. The first grade is renowned for being very sloppy at the edges, ends and joints. It is very old kit. Your high grades and master grades will not suffer this problem as much, though if you preemptively strike and sand, clean, prepare all the parts and joints on all your future kits, the chances of chipping and scratching will not occur. This is why the first grade is an excellent kit to experiment these techniques before you go on a higher level of kit to address an over-exaggerated problem that will be a minor problem when you strike it and clean it up. Now I'm going to field a couple of interesting questions that my videos have collected over the past month that I just think will be fun and informative to share in this video. The collector asks, during my budget Royal Max 12 volt compressor airbrush combination, why do you want a filter? It seems to me it's just air passing through the tube, so what is it filtering? This is a really, really good question. One thing you notice when you're buying hobby compressors is they're pretty much marketed on its total PSI output, its controllability, the fact that it's oilless, which is very, very important, and sound. When you purchase industrial air compressors, most of the time it's used to power tools and have other functions, rarely not so much involved with spraying. With oil compressors, they have a tendency of having oil vapor or traces of oil going through the airline. Most of the time this doesn't matter, though passing through paint, that's a huge concern to us who airbrush. The second problem when you're compressing air with a piston, the motor heats up the air, which draws in a lot of moisture and condenses in a tank running through a tube. This collated water in the form of both vapor and droplets collect, run down the hose, and now you have water mixing with your paint. Sometimes it's not going to cause too much of a hassle depending on the type of paint and mix, though it is an element to the atomization and could cause extra pooling or over thinning or a lack of pigment density. Though if it's something like oils, enamels, lacquers, this completely ruins the chemical formulation and creates spots or other undesirable effects. And imagine if there's oil in the mix, it's a lot worse. To combat this, most compressors, large industrial 2 horsepower ones or the smaller hobby ones, will have this object at the end, a water trap. It's also a built-in gauge and a regulator to control how much pressure or PSI is coming out. You'll notice there's a glass vessel as well as a small metal nipple at the end. This is a water trap. It collects and collates all the water at the lowest point. The glass is normally chilled from the cool air, and the water condensates there immediately. By pulling the nipple up, with the pressure backing it, you vent a lot of the water out, which gets rid of most of the problem. Another common act when you're airbrushing is you face away from your project, spraying, hoping to get rid of any sort of droplets and the initial amount of moisture, then doing passes along your work. This is very important to note. Not all environments, airbrushing experiences and setups are the same. Some areas are humid, cold, weathery, moistury, whatever. Some people have this problem, some people don't. And the moisture trap does not remove or handle all the water in the air. This can cause a problem in atomization and the flow of your paint that you may be used to and always experienced and never addressed it, or it is a huge problem to your spraying. A inline water filter is a completely different device and is used in conjunction with a water trap unless the compressor is very, very tiny or very, very small, or taken off a tank or other device. There is a very tiny nipple, works the same way. You can vent the very little moisture that does develop in there. You can put this device just under your airbrush or anywhere along the line. Closer to the airbrush, the better. And there's a little cork material that prevents all water and oil from passing. Water filters have been around for a very, very long time. Iwata did a full metal one a while ago that was quite expensive and utilized by professionals and elite airbrushers. A lot of people from the States, Europe, the UK who are into airbrush art got fuel filters for car that would prevent water and fuel mixing together, and tapped that into their line to also draw out air and other undesirable liquids and whatnot. This new model that's coming out of China is very cheap on Amazon and eBay, only goes for a few dollars, and at its very little cost I found that the atomization has improved so much from my spraying. I started getting far smoother coats, as well as while doing gradients and other effects, just a finer effect. A popular term is prevention is better than a cure. If you have this problem or do not have this problem, it's worth trying out just to see if there's any difference, and that maybe you're ignoring something that would lead to a future bigger problem. It's just a simple, very cheap cog in a greater machine that's the complicated process of atomizing air and paint onto a surface. This individual reckons that 12-volt airbrush compressor combinations go for $10 on Wish. Doing a bit of research as someone who sells these sets and tests various different ones. The cheapest you can get it for is around the $35 to $40 US mark. Cheap shipping for regional areas, or a greater cost for international dispatch. Generally, the appropriate price to pay for one of these is around $50 to $70 US, or in my currency, between $60 to $100. Trust me, if I could find them at $10, I would have bought such a mountain of them to resell on and promote. Your heads would spin. I looked into it, including Wish, and after many hours of running around, nothing. In my response to criticism, as well as my thoughts on the 2017 Gunpla Builders World Cup, multiple heats, I received one question. I just saw this and I think you're off base in a few areas. For example, the issue with the regional contests in the US was absolutely the judges. Meiji couldn't judge every regional contest, so they brought in less experienced individuals as substitute judges. In places like Otakon, for example, the contest was completely botched as a low quality builders with major construction and painting flaws ended up winning first, second and third place. Go take a look at the winners and I would like to hear you for your opinion. This seems to be a case of leaving a comment after watching a few minutes or not looking into the points I had in the shortened as well as the long video regarding the judging process, especially in the US, but also for all the other heat regions and the world. Now, Mr. Kawaguchi is a legendary modeler in his own right, as well as the chief architect judge of the Gunpla Builders World Cup. He designed it with Bandai, though what many do not consider when entering, critiquing the competition, looking at who won, who lost and all that stuff, is analysing the rules as well as the judging criteria and elements that are important but not made known in either English or at all to the casual entering the competition. Now, due to how the model's placed, and if it's popular with everybody's opinion of what makes a good model and what doesn't make a good model, the judges and their experience is only a factor and one factor in this very large and complex matrix structure that is the rules and regulations of the Gunpla Builders World Cup. First, in my criticism, that the rules are set up in a way to select an eye candy model that they could use to promote the Gunpla brand and current kits. There are stipulations such as not utilizing copyrighted concepts and exploring new kits and the new popular marketable anime opposed to other kits that might be obscure or the choice of the builder and not in the interest of Bandai promoting their product through your model. Many models that were well built and through building criteria alone that should have won would have lost points or been purely disqualified because they didn't meet other criteria, be it copyright, which can have you disqualified immediately, or the choice of the subject, the design of how you put it together, and other elements that the judges find favourable for what meets Bandai and Japan's goals for a winner. The judges do not necessarily need experience, as they're following a list of instructions what to look out for. The rules are very confusing for the builders as they are building what they like without considering what they need to do to win. Bandai has their own agenda. Once translated from Japanese to English, the rules are just absolutely confusing and very poorly designed and put together for the judges, the organisers, and the people entering and building. It is my belief, and in these criticisms, if the rules were improved on and communication improved of what Bandai is exactly looking for, can lead the modelers to design and build a model for the goal to win, or at least understand why they're not placing as well, and the people who are viewing and appreciating it can understand why models have won. Gunpla modelers in America first need a call out for improvement of the organisation, the writing of the rules, and the communication of the competition. before they criticize the judging process. Once the rules are clear and everyone knows how to design the model, how to judge the models, and the audience is clear on what's being judged, then analyze the judges, then improve the judges. Unfortunately, they're being unfairly taken out of context if it's correct or not correct. None of us truly know. That's the conclusion of the Q&A segment. We've explored quite a few interesting aspects of painting, helping people along who are new to airbrushing, what brands, styles, things to look at and work with. Vallejo is always a popular topic to talk about, as well as alternatives to lacquer or the use of lacquer paints. It's always good to talk about the Gunpla Builders World Cup again and clean up some misconceptions, as well as throw in an alternative view why things seem to be the case before we start executing and shooting judges. And I always love to talk about the water trap. I think it doesn't get enough exposure and more people really need to jump onto that. Any Australians watching, the Salt Mines does sell it. You can have a look at the link down below. For the gentleman asking about joints, I forgot to mention that my Let's Build the Iron-Blooded Orphan 1/100 Greys. It's a very long video, though I sort of go from taking parts off the runners to gluing, preparing, modifying, fixing, all the way to the painting stage. I do address and touch up on the point of joints, scratching and paints. That could be quite helpful if you're willing to watch the whole video, and there's another one like it in the works. Thank you very much for watching. As always, until next time, stay tuned for further content. We'll catch you guys next time, and maybe next month. Make sure you're in line to see the request video and put in your own questions or a request for a shout out, other discussion topics. Might not necessarily have to be a question. It can be asking for an opinion or a research piece, theories as well. Thank you very much for watching. And just a reminder, check the links down below for the various social medias and other things I'm working on. I do have a few interesting videos more around tools and other exciting gizmos and gadgets coming out soon. A couple of tanks and a very big long-awaited garage kit that I've been working on for more than a year. We're also coming to a conclusion with the Providence Gundam. That should be done in a little more than a month's time, which will free us up to do other content making. And sometime this month I'm also going to do an update on the injection molding project, so stay around for that. See you guys later.